Today is last worship of 2020, and I thought 2020 is going to be a wonderful year. And Vision X was thinking about. We thought about the Vision X, which is a youth retreat. We thought about various ideas of vision statements and the theme, and none of them panned out. So it's been an interesting year to say the least, and looks like we have to hunker down a little bit longer until maybe even 2022 or end of 2021. Anyway, as I reflected back on this year, I thought it would be appropriate for us to speak from the Book of Lamentations. And the Book of Lamentation is a book where it deals with a lot of pain and suffering, particularly because the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom of Judah, they all been disintegrated and been taken away because their unfaithfulness to God, and Assyrians and Babylonians, they come and they take everything, destroy everything, and everyone has been put in a chain and taken away on an exile. As I thought about that, kind of an interesting thought came to mind in terms of how we can express this time and what would be appropriate for us to go through a lot of these changes and laments of our own, the pressures that we feel and disillusionment that we feel. How can we get through this time? And I think lamentation is really helpful. The illustration that I kind of just sprung upon me was, sometimes I make dinner for my family. I say sometimes because it's mostly me. And sometimes I make udon. And to make that, it's like the easiest broth to make. You just need pretty much 2 or 3 ingredients, and there you have it. And it takes 10 minutes to get all the flavors out of dashi, which is kind of like a thick seaweed. And it takes another 10 minutes to take all the flavors out of the fish flakes called katsuobushi. Anyway, so it's just a quick process, and it's just really a nice meal at the end of the day, especially if you don't have time. But then there are other broth, other type of stock that 10 minutes or 20 minutes doesn't do any justice to it. You need 12 hours or sometimes even 16 hours. And if you're into tonkotsu ramen and you like that ramen stuff, and you know what I'm talking about, it really is not labor intensive, so I hear, but time consuming. You do need to plan your day around making this one dish because it is a 12 to 16 hour ordeal. But you boil it at a slow simmer, and that long process takes everything that is locked in the bones, and it brings out whatever flavor that is in there and brings it out into the stock. Most of our prayers is kind of like udon broth, where it's quick and it's on the go. But there are times in our life where life is not so easy and simple. It's actually really complex, and there are hidden things that are inside of us. And putting up that happy Christian facade is no longer possible. Lamentation is like a bone broth where it teaches us to come to a rolling boil, articulate enough of what is inside of us so that our phoniness and our veneer of I'm okay, I'm a rock, I'm Christian, I have faith, all that just simply disintegrates. And the real thing, whatever's locked inside of us, inside of a hardened heart, has to come out. And right now, it is that time where we are experiencing the rolling boil. We have to get stuff out of us. Otherwise, we're not going to see what is truly inside of us. As I shared with you, Israel has lost its nation, and we don't really identify with that because we don't know what it means to lose the border, to lose all your political, military, and sovereignty, and and land and home and everything that you own, like one day is gone and it's no more, and the entire nation becomes a refugee. And it's hard for us to imagine, but there are things that happen as a result of nationwide catastrophe. And that is that there are unspeakable sorrow and indescribable pain that is inside of you. And lamentation teaches us how to deal with that, how to get that out. And the way that lamentation deals with this nationwide catastrophe is that they take their time to articulate everything that they're feeling and more. First three chapters of Lamentation, it's 5 chapters long, and the first 3 chapters is organized acrostically, or I guess we can say simply alphabetically. And for English readers, this is not obvious to us because we don't read Hebrew and we don't understand Hebrew alphabets, but is A to Z or A to Z. A, and they say something about the letter A, and they articulate their pain and their sorrow. And then they move on to B, and they keep talking about, with letter B, they find a word that starts with letter B, and they talk about their pain. And they go through every letter, A to Z, and they do it again in chapter 2. Letter A goes on the top, and letter Z at the bottom. And in chapter 3, they do it all over again. Expressing our sorrow and our pain and our anxiety has to be comprehensive and articulate. It has to almost be mechanical because sometimes you don't even know what it is that you have within you until you went through the list top to bottom 3 times. You realize that there's a lot of your emotions and pressures and doubts and anxieties that are locked inside of you need to come out. Praying just off top of the head is no longer really useful for us in this time. But we need to be comprehensive and learn to be articulate. Stop thinking that you're fine, and maybe you are fine, I don't know. But I bet you that even if you feel fine, there are others who do not. And you can pray on their behalf in this time, being comprehensive, being articulate, and being careful in the way that you pray for them. And this because this articulation of pain goes beyond yourself, as we see in Lamentation. Lamentation is not a book about how the author feels about everything and how author has lost everything. He's not merely describing his private inner life and his inner struggle and what goes beyond in his own life. But he goes through young, old princesses, and the rich and the poor, and the mother and son and then daughters, everybody in the city, everybody in his nation, they all get their mention. He brings every one of them. He doesn't miss anybody in his kingdom. And he shares with God what he sees happening. Some of us are faring better than others during this pandemic. And I honestly think that's wonderful and that's great. But what is it that you see now that you can bring up to God in prayer? How can you bring the pain of others and be a compassionate person in the same way that God is compassionate with you, and bring their pain and petition for them on their behalf? What is their role in their pain and their suffering? How is God calling you, and how is God leading you to meet people that are suffering? Or if we are just saying, I'm okay, I'm not really affected by the pandemic. Actually, in some ways, it's better. And that's just the way it is. If that is you at the end of 2021, you really must look at your faith and ask yourself, Does God have sovereignty over my life? Do I truly know the love of God that He has for me? If so, why am I so calloused? And why am I not able to pray and be compassionate to those who are suffering? We must see the pain of others. We must get up and look around, listen to the news, listen to the stories, give people a call, and find out how people are suffering. Sometimes what happens is that a tragedy strikes in people's lives. There's pandemic. But it's not just that event in of itself. But because of that event, there are other emotional and mental consequences. I was watching the news, and I watched this news a few years ago, and this woman's house was broken into. And luckily nobody was hurt, but she was sharing how she lives in paranoia now, especially with her younger kids. She doesn't know how to deal with the break-in, and she's afraid that this will happen again. And sometimes people break up with their boyfriends or girlfriend, or something relationally traumatic happens, and that's bad in of it, and that's bad. But in addition to that, sometimes what we feel is we have this distrust of the opposite gender. What I'm trying to say to you is that pandemic has side effects on people's lives and in their mind. People are feeling lonely. People are feeling anxious, and people feel pressure, and they feel that they don't want to do anything beyond what they must do to get through their day. And I want you to know, if you're feeling that way today, I want you to know that it is perfectly fine. Not in the sense that, don't worry, this will all go away, but it's part of the natural grieving process. And if you are on the side of the fence where you feel disillusioned by the fact that people don't love you enough during this time, that people are not caring and people are not dropping in and visiting you and loving you and taking care of you and express how important you are to them in this time, I want you to have some room in your heart to forgive them and to understand that we're all suffering together. Do not be critical, because this is just side effects of pandemic. The author of Lamentation understood this very well. And he says that even the most compassionate woman, even the gentlest of all people, are committing unspeakable crimes. The people who were perfectly fine previously are no longer acting like themselves. That their compassion have dried up, and they readily commit crimes that are unspeakable to mention here today. But if you want to know, check it out. It's in chapter 2 and 3. So this is time where we need to deal with the consequences of our suffering. Not only the suffering itself, but what that suffering does, the damages that it brings to us as people, to us as a nation, and to us as a church. Bringing all of these things to God is how we will get through this time. Home of prayer is that we bring everything to God comprehensively in the most articulate way possible. As the author goes through this tumultuous time, in chapter 3, in verse 22 and 23 and 22 and 23, he says, the steadfast of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke of his youth. First time in the book of Lamentation, the author speaks to God. Until now, he was just articulating all the bad things in his life. He was just complaining to God. This is wrong. This is wrong. That's what's happening to her. That's what's happening to him. And he is merely laying down all the wrong things, all the bad things that are happening in his life. But as he goes through all those things, finally in chapter 3, he has space to turn to God. And in the darkest moment of his prayer, where he says he has gravel in his mouth and there is utterly no hope in his life, that's where he turns to God and says that the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. That God's love never ceases. I know that my life is dark. I know that there are terrible things happening in my life. But I do remember that his love never ceases. Many of us, when we go through a trial, what we try to do is we try to discover God in that moment. And I believe that is wise. Trying to understand why this is happening to you, or what the will of God is as you suffer through this time, and you're trying to find meaning in that moment. But the wisest thing you and I can do is not to discover God in our moment of suffering, but to remember God who was faithful in the past. And that's what the author of Lamentation had discovered. But wait a minute. I remember God. He's a covenantal God. He's the one who called Abraham, who was faithful to him. He did not give up upon his family, and he brought Abraham's family out of Egypt. And that family became a nation, and that family had received the promised land that was promised to Abraham many, many generations ago. I remember that God. So if God is faithful in bringing judgment to me, to our people, then he is even greater in his faithfulness in bringing restoration and to keep his promise of keeping Israel his people. Remembering God is how, number one, we articulate comprehensively of all the things that we are going through. And number two, remembering God in our trial is how we go through difficult times. If you try to discover God in the moment, you may find that it's very, very difficult. But it's not so hard when you think about how God has rescued you and how he has been faithful to you. And you went through similar thing before, and now you're simply saying, I shall go through it again because God is faithful to me. Last but not least, the psalmist finds, or the author of Lamentation finds, the language of creation and his hope in God. Notice he says that it is good. It says it 3 times, just like in the creation narrative. The Lord is good to those who wait for him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. I believe this is deliberate part of the author to say that even though there is destruction today, God is making good what is chaos and what is destruction. If God is one who made everything out of chaos, one who created everything out of nothing, then God will make us into a nation again, although we have become nothing. That God will reorder chaos of our life once again, so that our life is livable, and this land will later once again be inhabited. You and I have the advantage of seeing the 2,000 years or more of Israel's history. They have lost their land many, many times, and they have only occupied their promised land for a brief period of time. But even now, to this day, they have got their land back since I think it was 1964. But until that, they never truly had sovereignty after they were ransacked in 70 AD. They waited upon the Lord because that land was promised to them. And if we wait upon the Lord today, deep in our prayer, looking around, articulating not only our pain, but also pulling out the pain of others, waiting upon the Lord for that creation, good, good, good. And the Lord will not fail us. In this story, what we see is that the author of Lamentation is kind of a Christ figure in a sense, because he doesn't just say, this is what's happening to me, and this is what's happening to other people, but he uses the word my young woman, my young men, my priests, my elders, my heart. God, they are all suffering. These are my people. These are my nations. This is my nation. In the same way, when we are suffering, Christ doesn't just look and say, well, you need to sit tight and be patient. But he is a co-sufferer with us. That his compassion never fails precisely because he is an incarnate God, God who took on our flesh and suffered with us. He knows what it means to be tempted. He knows what it means to suffer and lose and betrayed. And he is suffering with us. And he is praying with us and for us on our behalf in the throne room, articulating the pains and the temptations and failings that we ourselves are not able to articulate. Jesus is going from A to Z, Alpha and Omega, from beginning to the end, articulating all of our temptations and our sins and our suffering on our behalf. I believe that is what gives me the true hope. That I believe in God who sympathizes, empathizes with my weakness and my frailties and my sins and my temptations. That he's praying for me and that he's inviting me to do the same, to pray for you and pray for the city and pray for people around us. As we begin in 2021 and journey through this pandemic, I would like us to pray like the author of Lamentations. I would like us to take even one letter or two letters of the alphabet and begin to articulate that into prayer. I know it seems a little bit mechanical, but you'll be surprised how your prayer will be shaped when you put yourself into that kind of framework. Letter A can be afraid, apathetic, or I'm angry. Letter B can be big plans that never came through. Brevity of life, insecurity, and brothers that I haven't seen or I haven't talked to, or the brokenness of our heart and our security. C can be clear-headedness that we no longer possess. Cheer or cheerlessness that we experience, and the character that has been challenged. Go through the letters. I really do challenge you to go through the letters. And as you go through the letters, just expand on it. Pick a word and expand on it. Suffering and trials, they stack up all these residues in us, and they get embedded into our bone. It's almost like when you eat sugary junk, that sugar gets embedded into your teeth. It just goes right in there. And they have consequences. It creates doubts, bitterness, fatigue, and we long for normalcy. And it also unfurls some of the dormant darkness that we didn't even know that we're capable of doing. And we become apathetic beyond what we thought we were able. Suffering doesn't have to be the last thing or the last word in our life. Or suffering, or this kind of way of living does not have to be how we end this year and the next year, or how we get out of this pandemic. God recreates in times like this. God is inviting us to articulate and be comprehensive in expressing my people's pain and the things of my own heart, so that we can experience the recreational grace and love of God. This time, if we are cautious and careful, if we have tools to get through this time, and if we trust in the Lord, we will experience the compassion of the Lord, which is new every morning.